So the title's going to be Godliness in the Pit. Godliness in the Pit. The title was, and this is more appropriate to the outline, 2 officials, 2 dreams, 1 betrayal, 3 fates.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Yeah. That is pretty much the outline, though. That's a mouthful for sure, but it does divide the chapter nicely, and we will spend, so again, godliness in the pit, but we will spend our time in these headings. First, these 2 officials from Pharaoh's court. Secondly, there are 2 dreams and the interpretations that God gives Joseph for each man. Third, we will consider the terrible betrayal by the chief cupbearer against Joseph. And fourth, we will consider the 3 fates of these men. When all that is done, the last thing I want to do is just to consider carefully a little bit more about the man Joseph and his remarkable character throughout this whole chapter and make some application for us today. So I won't reserve all of my comments about Joseph until the end because I can't really explain the text and talk about it without doing that, but we will revisit those things and look at them a little more carefully. And that really, I guess, is the main thing I want us to walk away from today. And so, Godliness in the Pit will be the title. I'd like to go ahead and pray, and then rather than read through the whole chapter, I would like to today just read through a kind of a section at a time and then make comment as we go. So why don't we pray? Heavenly Father, we thank you for these stories for us, these things as they happened, being written down, passed on to us. There's a huge chunk of this book of Genesis that's given over to this story of this man Joseph and all that you did in his life for him and for others. And so we pray that we would be attentive, we would get all that is here for us and walk away the better for it. I pray that these words are plain and clear to all. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, so first of all, 2 officials. I want to, we'll read the first 4 verses, but before we do that, I want to draw your attention to what is said in verse 7. So he, that is Joseph, asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" I want you to see that, so you see that specifically they are called officers. These are high-ranking men. They're not just servants in the house, though they were that, but they had charge of others. They were officers. So my translation says the cupbearer. I believe I've read through some translations that say the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And that's a reflection not so much of the word cupbearer, but as the idea is he's an officer. He's not just someone who, set the table. He did more than that. Even though he certainly had that was part of what he did. So let's look at the first 4 verses. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. So there we have it again. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. The first thing to say is there's this phrase, sometime. Verse 1 begins, sometime after this. Well, after what? Well, verse 23, the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Remember, Joseph had been in Potiphar's house. He had been falsely accused. Potiphar had him thrown into the prison, which Potiphar himself had charge of, though he likely had an underling under him that was in charge directly of that prison. And so that man who was in charge of that prison under Potiphar took a liking to Joseph, saw that little tasks he was given had succeeded, and he was honest in them, and things were done well. And so he got to the place eventually where he didn't have any concern at all over anything. The man was just, that's the way people are, right? You have some responsibility that people are counting on you to do, and you're busy, and something happens, and you delegate some bit of it, and they do better than you ever did with it. And it's not long, and you have kind of allowed them just to do everything, and you're doing nothing. And this is pretty much what had happened. That's what happened for Potiphar, and now it's what happened to the man who answers to Potiphar about this prison. And this continued for some time. It says some time after this. So Joseph has been in charge of all the menial tasks that this man didn't want to do, and all the things that this man didn't want to bother to do for some time. And then the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. Mark this down. They committed an offense. They committed a sin. Literally, it is they sinned against their lord, the king of Egypt. They sinned against him. That's the very thing that Joseph did not do against his master and against God, his God as well. But these men did so. So particularly for the kids, let's just maybe ask ourselves and remind ourselves what a cupbearer would be. A cupbearer, the basic sense, would be a man whose job was to ensure the king's drinks were according to his tastes, the things that he liked. They were the finest around. They were pure and fresh, or maybe aged and fine, right? But they were the best that was around. They were up to the standards and up to the image which the king sought to put forth to his subjects. He meant to have such a palace as only the finest of drinks would be served. Moreover, as the cupbearer, he may also have been the one generally in charge of serving all the food and drinks at the table. Other translations would refer to this man as the chief butler, right? So this is the idea. He's the one who comes and prepares the actual meal itself. He's the bearer of the cup. He's the one who sets it all up and prepares the meal. He's not the cook. He doesn't prepare those things, but he's the one who, the way it looks on the table, the way it's set out, and every plate's in its right position. Every utensil, every seat is just so, right? You go to a fancy restaurant, the napkins are just a certain way, this sort of thing. This is his job. He's the chief cupbearer. By no means is he the only cupbearer. He's the chief cupbearer. No doubt he had a whole staff serving him or helping him in his task. Because after all, this is Pharaoh's palace. It's not just one or two people you're providing food for. And so you might think of him as the master of ceremonies in Pharaoh's dining room. Right? This is his job. And it says he committed a sin against Pharaoh, or a great offense. Moses tells us, he doesn't tell us what it was, but he leaves no doubt as to the fact that this man messed up big time. It's not as if Pharaoh came and the meal was cold that day, and that was an offense to Pharaoh. It would be, rightly so. He's got one job, to make things a certain way. And so Pharaoh just flew off the handle and said, that's it, go to prison. That's not what we're told. We're told they did something wrong. They actually committed a genuine offense against Pharaoh. Such a person could have angered the king by slacking in their work, just failing to do what they've been told again and again to do, or perhaps by failing to have enough in a repeated fashion, or by being late to the meal. Pharaoh says, at this time we need to eat, and we just never eat then, right? Could be an issue. Any number of things. The temptation, I think, is to think that he was thrown into prison due to Pharaoh being very fickle and temperamental. But that's not what we're told. It'd be a mistaken judgment for us. We would be rushing to judgment to think of Pharaoh in that way. This Pharaoh, maybe other pharaohs were that way, but this Pharaoh, everything about this story in Genesis shows us this Pharaoh was a wise and discerning man. And here he had this man thrown into prison, into the pit. What about the chief baker? The chief baker. Well, this one's a bit easier, right? Merely the one who was in charge of all the food that was prepared and cooked for the king and all of his guests and all of his court. It was his job to prepare the food. He didn't bring it out and serve it and set it up. He prepared it. Again, this is a bit easier. Perhaps he was caught stealing. Perhaps he didn't make enough food. Perhaps he was using less than the best ingredients. Or perhaps he repeatedly disappointed the king with what he made or the way he made it. Perhaps the meal was too often served cold. Or perhaps he simply refused to fix certain dishes according to the command of his king. Maybe he was too often too lazy to prepare all that was expected. Well, I know we're supposed to have this, and anytime we have those things, we're also supposed to have this, but we weren't able to get it in time. We weren't, whatever it may be. Or perhaps it was some huge celebration that in Pharaoh's mind, it was very important to be done a certain way. And these two men together utterly failed, despite their continued reassurances perhaps to Pharaoh that it would be held up to a certain standard. Whatever it was, they had committed some sort of offense. And it was in connection with their service to Pharaoh. And they both had been sent into the pit as the king's prisoners. I don't assume. So this word that this phrase that he's committed the sin against the king, you could imagine a lot of things could fall into that category. And there are some times in Scripture where it has to do with outright rebellion, like a coup. And I don't mean at all to say that it was that, because I don't think you would ever restore those men if you would, they would have ways of getting at you. They could poison your drink or your food or something. So you wouldn't restore a man like that to that office. But just to say that the idea is it does have to do with a real offense. It's not just something imagined or something that, again, Pharaoh is temperamental and therefore he did this to them, but it's a real offense. People would have felt like they got their just deserts. So they were thrown into this prison. Now, it says that he put them, this is Pharaoh, verse 3, and he put them in custody of the house of the captain of the guard. That would be Potiphar, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. So verse 3, when it says the captain of the guard, that's clearly Potiphar. Verse 4 might also be Potiphar. Potiphar himself may have told his man, hey, make sure that Joseph is the one attending to them. Which I think is very likely. Or perhaps even the man under Potiphar made this decision. Regardless, those who knew Joseph and those who knew the high-ranking nature of these officials knew that if you wanted to make sure they were taken care of, you needed to put them in Joseph's charge. And this is what happened. He was appointed to be with them and to attend them. Right? He says that. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. There's that word again, some time. We're not told how long. A month? 6 months? A year? 2 years? We're not told how long. For some time. They continued for some time. What would his service to them include? I think it would include bringing them food and drink, possibly changes of clothes, and we could just say any other needs they might have according to whatever instructions the king gave for them while they were in prison. We're not exactly told. Were they told that they had to go in prison, and they were in this prison, but they were to be treated better? Or were they to be treated worse? Were they just to be treated there like any other of the prisoners? We're not told exactly. But they were thrown into this prison, and they were put under Joseph's charge, and he took care of them, like he did probably many of the other prisoners. So those are the two officials, kind of their situation and what we know about them up to this point. They have been prisoners for some time. Now let's look at the two dreams. Verse 5. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. Each his own dream, and each with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Please tell them to me. So we're looking at these two dreams. Let's look at the first dream, the dream of the cupbearer. Actually, I'm going to flip the way I'm doing this a little bit. Let me say a few things about these verses before we get into this next dream, or this dream. Look at Joseph. So when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" Notice his tender care for these men. It's really amazing. I mean, he's there for years now, wrongly accused in this prison, this pit, this dungeon as he describes it. And he sees these men, and they're concerned. They've got a worried look on their face. First of all, he notices it. I mean, he could have just been going about his business. What did it matter? What does he care? But he does. You just see his character. It's amazing. And not only does he notice it, but then he cares enough to say, "Hey, what's wrong? Why are you so downcast? I mean, I understand you're here, and that's not great, but you haven't looked this way since the day you got here, or you've never looked this distraught and concerned. What's wrong? Tell me. How can I help you?" It's just amazing. I mean, prisoners don't usually treat one another this way. But this is the way Joseph is. He was genuinely concerned for them. It's really remarkable. And they said to him, notice what's wrong. They said to him, "We've had dreams." And you think, oh, it was a bad nightmare. No, they don't say that. "We've had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." It doesn't disturb them that they had a dream, but there's no one to interpret them. Have you ever, you know this a little bit in your own experience. Sometimes you wake up and you're aware, "Oh, I had a dream last night," and it's no big deal. And then there's other times you had this dream, and you can't stop thinking about it. And it's just with you all the time. This dream's different. There's something different about this dream. I don't know, does it mean something? Why can't I stop thinking about it? What's the significance of this dream? They have those kind of dreams, each the same night. And each man is convinced this dream means something. And if they had been out of the prison, they would have gone immediately or gone to or summoned someone to interpret this dream for them, who could tell them what it means. Whether they would be accurate or not, they would have sought such a person. But they're distressed. The reason they're so downcast is because they've been given this dream and they know there's a meaning, but they can't get to the meaning because there's no one there to interpret for them. So the thought is, something's going to happen to us or for us. Something is going to change in our life, and I don't know what it is, and I can't find out what it is, and it's driving us crazy. were terribly concerned. What does this mean? And that's why they're so distressed. Now, think about this now. I mean, it's one thing for them to feel that way, or to wonder, I wish I could find out what this means. But to be so distressed about it that when someone passes by and sees you, they say, what's wrong? What's going on? Tell me. They're showing it, both of them, visibly. So these men are very worked up. They're so persuaded that I had a dream and there is an interpretation, but I can't get the interpretation. The gods, they would say, are speaking to us, but we can't tell what they're saying. What a thing. I mean, if only the average person on the streets would have the same attitude, right? God might be speaking to me. I just want to know what He's saying. This is kind of their attitude here. They're distressed because they can't get at the meaning. How can I understand unless someone tells me? And then listen to Joseph. And Joseph said to them, verse 8, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. There is in that statement an operating assumption that he carries with him this day. He woke up this day and he believed this thing. And he walked into their room, wherever they were stationed, and he saw their need, or saw that they were distraught, and he said, what's wrong? And they said something. And he had this assumption in his head, and so he spoke this way. And the assumption is the same thing Moses has already told us at the end of chapter 39. Verse 23, the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. I mean, if you were to tell me I had this dream last night, and I said, listen, interpretations belong to God, therefore tell me. The assumption is, I believe God is with me. That if you tell it to me, God might give His answer to you through me, because God's with me. Do not interpretations belong to God? He didn't say, therefore, go pray to God. He says, tell me. I can probably give you an interpretation because they belong. The reason I can give you an interpretation is not because I'm a great interpreter of dreams, but because God interprets dreams. So therefore, tell me, and I can help you. It's really amazing. Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. God is with him. He believes it. It's not just Moses telling us this. Joseph's telling us. God is with me. And He works through me. So, now verse 9. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream there was a vine before me, one vine, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as those 3 branches, as soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth and the clusters ripened into grapes. It was just sudden, like watching a time-lapse video, right? It just happened in his dream. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house, for I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. Now, we will talk in a minute about the nature of his interpretation, but I want to wait until we talk about the chief baker's dream as well. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I want you to notice the suddenness of his restoration. Right? You find that in the dream. Right? As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. And then these things happened. And then Joseph, in his interpretation, speaks about this is the interpretation, 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will what? Lift up your head and restore you to your office. He's not just going to be free from prison. He's restored directly to his office. You shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. It's going to be sudden and full. Then he mentions payment. This would be typical. You go to a man, you have a dream, you want an interpretation, he says, okay, I can interpret dreams for a price. And you agree, and that's how it goes. Well, here's Joseph, and he says, look, interpretations belong to God, so tell them to me. And he tells him the dream. He gives the interpretation, and the payment requested is simply this: just remember me. When it goes this way, when it goes well with you, and please do me this kindness, to mention me to Pharaoh to get me out of this place, out of this house. For I was indeed out of this house. He didn't say out of this pit. Out of this house. Free me from Potiphar. He's still Potiphar's servant, remember? Potiphar put him into the prison that Potiphar had charge of. Free me from this house. For I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. I'm not lawfully made a slave. In the ancient world, to steal someone and sell them as a slave carried with it the death penalty. So it's remarkable. It's not as if it's just a light thing. If he's been wronged here, he should be freed. Get me out of this house because I was stolen. And even now, once I was in this man's house as a slave, okay, maybe that was wrong, but then you committed some grave sin against your master, and he's rightly thrown you into prison, and so to prison you shall remain. No, and here also I've done nothing that they should put me into the pit. I'm not truly a slave, and I'm certainly no criminal. Remember me to get me out of here. So, when all this goes well for you, and you have Pharaoh's favor again, use that favor. Venture out, risk something by sticking your neck out there for me and telling them about me and my case, that I might be freed. That's what he's seeking. When you see Joseph making that request and that petition, I hope you can see that, we often think of Joseph, he's just in prison and just doing these things, and then God just acts and he's just out, as though Joseph was just content to be in prison. He is trying to work these situations out so that he gets free. He's not content. This is his appeal to Caesar, you might say, like Paul makes. Get me out of here. I don't want to die in this place. I don't believe this is what God has for me, and I'm actively seeking to change the situation. There are times where it can be wrong for us to actively seek to change the situation. Paul himself had prayed 3 times. The Lord would remove this thorn in the flesh, and then he got an answer, and it seems like he stopped praying about this. Joseph is not in that situation. He has this opportunity. It seems like this would be the means by which he can get out. And so he urges it upon the man. This, if you want a payment, will be this. This is how you pay me. Remember me, for I have been unjustly made a slave and unjustly imprisoned. Now let's look at the chief baker's dream and interpretation. Verse 16, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you, right? You'll have your head lifted up, but it will be from you, and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. Think, what? Here's this guy. Here's the chief baker. They both have dreams. They know there's interpretations. They're really concerned. Maybe they've talked to one another about the dreams, and they're both very perplexing. And the cupbearer is the first one to venture forth and say something to Joseph. Maybe he was more fond of Joseph, or who knows what. He's more desperate, maybe. Who knows? But he ventures forth. And then it says specifically, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable. So the idea is, yeah, me too. Tell me about my dream. I mean, he was hesitant, but with such a good interpretation, why not? I mean, one of the reasons these dream interpreters had made money and had, it's like if you go to a dream and you go to 5 different interpreters and they're all telling you just kind of ho-hum things, and one guy says, one day, 5 years from now, maybe 10, it's unclear to me, I can't perceive it, but something wonderful is going to happen. You're like, oh, I like that guy. I'm going to go. So you go to him more often. And so here's the chief baker is like, oh, when he saw that the interpretation was favorable, now, okay, now I'll let the Hebrew tell me what's going to happen to me. This sounds good. I'm getting ready for this. As if he has any power over as if when he says, well, I say it means this, therefore that will happen. He doesn't have that ability. The interpretation is just the translation of the message. This is what God told you would happen. I'm explaining it to you. But that's not the way these interpreters usually work. They're kind of reading you and the situation and the dream and trying to make it seem logical to you, like, oh yeah, I see why that would have meant that. I don't know why I didn't understand the dream meant that before. You're excellent at your job and this is favorable. Here's your money, and you go on your way. How much money are you going to get paid as an interpreter of dreams if someone comes to you and you give them bad news and put them in a really bad mood? You're not likely to get much. You want to make that person, if you're out for money, you want to make that person think, in just a few hours' time, money's not even going to matter to you. Pay up. Oh, well, since I'm going to get, $1 million in an hour, here's all my money. It's like, be so favorable to these people. Give a great interpretation. And so this guy, when he said, man, this guy's good. This Hebrew is good at this. So I had a dream too. Let me tell you, it's real similar to that last one. There were those 3 days, there's 3 cakes. They were cake baskets on my head, and the tallest one way up there were all sorts of baked foods for Pharaoh, just like he had the Pharaoh's cup. This is really good. I think I'm going to be restored at this. And the upper, so there was all these things for Pharaoh, but it's a little bit different because in the other one, this guy, he was squeezing the grapes and stuff, but this one, these birds, they kept getting at the basket. I imagine he envisioned himself in the dream, if not actively trying to get them away and do this for Pharaoh, at least feeling like, oh, that's not good, I don't want that. Like being opposed to it in his mind and in his heart, like wishing it wasn't this way. And so he's kind of for Pharaoh too. So what does it mean? And Joseph answered and said, well, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. And you think, oh, you could imagine him just, yes, I knew it. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head. Yes, from you. What? Right? And hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. End of quote. Seemingly end of conversation. I mean, you can imagine he's just silent. Like, try again, or something. What I promise I'll remember you. Come on. What would you do? What is he? But so this is the end of it. Imagine his terror over the next 3 days. I mean, is the Hebrew right? Is this going to happen? The one guy is kind of getting his clothes pressed and ready. And I don't know what. Maybe he's doing the same thing, hoping that he can somehow make it go better when he comes before Pharaoh if this really happens? I don't know. But he's got to be terrified. I mean, the situation is out there. It hasn't happened yet, but it's going to go so badly for him when he gets there that he's going to be hung and birds are going to eat his flesh. Think of the terror of that too for a rich Egyptian. As a culture, they spend so much time in preparing a deceased body for burial, to prepare it for in their idea of the next life. And here, he's going to be hung up outside on a tree and eaten by the birds. It's terrifying. Well, what happens? Now we're on to this. Well, sorry, I wanted to talk about this interpretation a little bit. Notice that the interpretation, I think, is not intuitive or obvious concerning a number of things. I mean, first of all, the 3 days. I mean, I don't think you would go through this and think, well, you know, there's one vine with 3 branches, that represents 3 days. Like, who would come up with that? 3 cakes represent 3 days. We all kind of felt that way. Having heard the first interpretation, we thought, well, the 3 cakes could be 3 days. But notice this, though. Look at all the times 3 is repeated in this dream. In my dream, there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. It budded, it blossomed, it ripened. Okay, next verse. Pharaoh, that's one mention of Pharaoh. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. 3 times. Verse 11 again. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Another 3 times. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. There's all these 3s of everything. It's bizarre, and none of those 3s are mentioned. How can you tell which 3 is days and which 3s are important and which 3s are not? I don't know. It seems strange. 3 times the cup is mentioned, 3 times Pharaoh is mentioned, 3 verbs are mentioned that he does. 3 actions for the vine, or for the branches, and then 3 branches. And the 3 branches, those are obviously days, and this is what the other means. And the 3 doesn't matter in the other times, it's just that time. So it's not intuitive at all. You wouldn't guess at this. You wouldn't assume that this was what it would mean. It's not obvious at all. And then, I mean, in the dream, Pharaoh's baker wasn't being eaten by birds. It was the basket that was being eaten by birds. Why is now they're going to eat his flesh? It's such a, I mean, and he's going to lift your head from you. Where does that come from? I mean, you could look at, well, the uppermost basket. But nothing about the uppermost basket tells you he's going to lose his head. But for Joseph it did, because God interpreted it for him. It's like what Jesus does with the parables on another level. Right? Jesus gives the parables so that the crowds will hear but not hear. But his disciples who are listening with spiritual ears hear what he's saying and immediately see the plain and obvious truth. And here's this dream, and it doesn't make any sense. But God, who gives the interpretation to Joseph, it's very clear. So this is the nature of things. It really is a divine revelation that happens here. God gives him the interpretation. Now, we said the next thing was 1, betrayal. Let's look at these last 3 verses. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, we'll talk about that in a minute, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph but forgot him. All right, let's look at these here. It was Pharaoh's birthday. I didn't know Egyptians celebrated birthdays. I guess they do. It's something we seem to do across the globe, but I just had never in my mind thought about Egyptian culture and like, it's your birthday. Like, I just don't think of that. But you have, here in Scripture, it tells us Egyptians back then celebrated birthdays, particularly Pharaoh, right? He's going to have a big party. And, if you're a Pharaoh, you don't, like if you or I have a party, we think of like a birthday party thing, invite your friends and some peers and people like that, and you tend to operate that way. Pharaoh doesn't have peers. He has servants who he's fond of or not fond of. And he invites all his servants. Right? Made a feast for, it says, all his servants. I don't know how big this was, but he also lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. So the idea there is the king comes in and everyone bows and you look down. And the king comes over and recognizes you and grabs you by the chin maybe and lifts your head and says, hey, come with me. It's a huge honor. And it could also be, in the same sense, can be that they are released from prison. Their heads were lifted up. They were cast down, but they've been lifted up. And that's what it means specifically here. He lifted up their heads. He released them from prison, invited them to come. And while they were there, two things happened. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and that man was able to place the cup that even very day at that feast into Pharaoh's hand. It was sudden. It was immediate. Out of prison, said, hey, get back to your work. Now? Yes, right now, today. No one's better at this than you are. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had it interpreted to them. There's a number of ways this could have gone. I mean, you might ask, was some sick sort of game played here in Pharaoh's court to entertain him? We're not told the details. The winner would be restored, the loser would be hanged. You could imagine certainly some of the Roman emperors doing things like that, and certainly some other rulers throughout history. Is something like that possible? I don't know. I don't get that feeling for Pharaoh, but we're not told anything like that. Was Pharaoh perhaps always fond of the cupbearer and only had just been, before they were cast into prison, had been disappointed by the food, and therefore, really it was the baker only who was to blame, because since they've been cast out, the service hasn't been as good, but the food has been better. I don't know. Maybe, so bring them both out here. And he's finally decided, got to the bottom of what actually had happened. He says, listen, cupbearer, you're great at this. So I want you to come back, and what better day than at my birthday? But oh, the baker. We've not had any problems with the food since you've been gone, right? And so therefore, all the excuses you gave me, the things you said you couldn't do and that were impossible, everyone else is finding it very easy to do. I don't know. I mean, hanging him would seem like a cruel punishment for that. I mean, what somehow connected with what his offense, either it was discovered that it was all actually the baker, the cupbearer had nothing to do with it, something, somehow, some way. Now, this was done on Pharaoh's birthday, and my point in mentioning this to you is not to tell you specifically what the connection is, but that there's likely a connection. It's Pharaoh's birthday, and in this feast that he's going to have for all of his servants, in that setting, Moses tells us specifically that setting. And I haven't figured out why, and I'm sorry I haven't figured out why, but I haven't figured out why. Wouldn't it be just fine for Moses to say, and it happened on the third day that these men their faces were lifted up, and this is the fate of one, and this was the fate of the other. That would be sufficient to tell me it was fulfilled. But he gives me the setting and says it was Pharaoh's birthday, this big feast was being thrown. I don't know why I need to know that. I've racked my brain at this. Maybe some of you have ideas. for me, I can come up with different ideas, just kind of conjecture. I've kind of mentioned some of them, how this might play out. But I don't know. I don't know. And that's where we are with that one. That's where I am. I would welcome any suggestions you might have when we're finished here. So that's what happens here. But he says, so all that happened. And then verse 23, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Yet. And that's where I get this idea of this betrayal. These things happened as Joseph had interpreted them, and yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. We're supposed to assign blame here with this contrasting. And yet, even though it happened just as Joseph told him not 4 days before, yet they did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Remember me was his one request, the essence of his request. Remember me, who I am, what I did, what my situation is, and be kind to me and speak of me to Pharaoh. But he does not remember him, but rather forgot him. He just forgot him. It was a betrayal. This man, this cupbearer, was not willing to test his recently regained favor for the sake of Joseph. He wasn't going to put himself on the line at all for him. It was selfish betrayal. And that's tragic. But think of this. It has to be. Imagine the situation if he remembered him right away, spoke to Pharaoh about him, Joseph gets released, and when the famine comes, Joseph's nowhere around. Long forgotten and gone. None of these things could happen. It actually had to happen this way. As awful as it sounds, he had to be left there. So, it just had to be. Now, last heading in terms of the text is 3 fates. And to get this third fate, I have to jump into chapter 41, verse 1. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And so that goes on. So 2 whole years. So 3 fates. Verse 21, he restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. One man is restored to high office. Second fate, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. So one is eaten by the birds after being hung by a tree. Not by a tree, in a tree. And then third, Joseph was not remembered, was forgotten, and remained in prison for 2 whole years. The only reason it ends with 2 whole years is because something else happened later in the story. We'd rather just think Joseph remains in prison, nothing changed. Very different fates. I mean, think about it. These men in a prison cell, or some room in this dungeon, this pit, and they have this conversation. And in 4 days, one man is dead, being eaten, his flesh being eaten by the birds. Another man is serving in Pharaoh's court, as high as he's ever been, in full favor, and the other is completely forgotten and left in the pit to just continue on with the other prisoners. How drastically different those 3 fates are. It's like the worst possible, the best possible, and one that's, I wouldn't call it in the middle, but it's definitely not the best possible. He's still alive, but that's kind of it right now. I don't know if it strikes you this way, but it struck me when I've often thought of a certain night at the end of my senior year of high school as being the last time that a certain group of my friends were all together. And there were also in that group of friends, maybe there's about 9 of us. Probably 5 of us were together, and then there were some other people who we were acquaintances with. We were friends with, but not good friends. They weren't kind of that same group, but we were kind of together. And I just mentioned mention 5. This was the last time these 5 people I'm going to mention, not by name, but we're all together in a room right after our senior year. One goes on to be pastor of a church. One ends up in a home for those with mental illness. One ends up making a fortune in real estate. One goes to prison. One dies within the year. That was our last time that those 5 guys were together. Before we were ever together again, those things have all happened. We can't ever be together again in that way. Now, I don't know that we all want to get together again, and we're all in different places in our lives. But it's profound. And I have often thought, when I remember hearing about this happened to this person, this happened to this person, and I would think about, well, when's the last time I was together with them? And for me, a lot of those guys, the last time I was together with any of them was all at that one night. So it struck me this way. But this kind of thing happens in life, right? There'll be a time when this will be the last time that all of us meet together. Something will happen and someone won't be here, and then another person won't be here, and then it'll have been the last time. And for some of us, wonderful things will happen. For others, awful things will happen. That's just the reality. That's how it will be. It's amazing. 3 fates. These 3 men were together. They were fellow prisoners for this night. And it wasn't the last night. They had a couple more nights, but it was the last night like this. Because after this night, things were looming large about what's going to happen in a couple days. Everything was changed. Now, let's just look at our last section today, a look at Joseph and some application for us today. Consider, first of all, his good character in prison, just in general. I could have mentioned this last time when we saw that last message saw him gaining favor in prison as well, because everything was succeeding. But I wanted to save it for now. And what I want to do on this particular point, his good character while in prison, is to read from Alexander McLaren's commentary on it. It's so well worded. So I'll read that and then we'll go on to some other subpoints here. So first of all, again, Joseph's good character in prison. Joseph's relations to jailer and fellow prisoners are beautiful and instructive. The former is called the keeper of the prison and is evidently Potiphar's deputy in more immediate charge of the prison. Of course, the great man of course, the great man, that is Potiphar, had an underling to do the work. And probably that underling, this man in charge of the prison, was not chosen for sweetness of temper, right? He's in charge of a bunch of prisoners, or facile leniency to his charges. But he fell under the charm of Joseph's character all the more readily, perhaps because his occupation had not brought many good men to his knowledge. This jewel named Joseph would flash all the more brightly for the dark background of criminals, and the jailer would wonder at a type of character so unlike what he was accustomed to. Eastern prisons today, even today, present a curious mixture of cruelty and companionship. The jailers are on intimate terms with prisoners and yet are ready to torture them. There is no discipline, nor any rules, nor inspection from others. The jailer does as he likes. So it seems to have been in Egypt. And there would be nothing unnatural in making a prisoner jailer of the rest and leaving everything in his hands. The keeper of the prison was lazy, like most of us, and very glad to shift duties onto any capable shoulders. Such a thing would, of course, be impossible with us, but it is a bit of true local coloring here. In other words, we wouldn't have a prison that operated this way, but it's a bit of true local coloring here. Joseph won hearts because God was with him, as the story is careful to point out. Our religion should recommend us, and therefore itself, to those who have to do with us. It is not enough that we should be severely righteous, as Joseph had been, or ready to meet trouble with stoical resignation, but we are to be gentle and lovable, gracious towards men, because we receive grace from God. We owe it to our Lord and to our fellows and to ourselves to be magnets to attract to Jesus by showing how fair He can make a life. Joseph in prison found work to do, and he did not shirk it. He might have said to himself, "This is poor work for me, who had all Potiphar's house to rule. Shall such a man as I come down to such small tasks as this?" He might have sulked or desponded in idleness. But he took the kind of work that offered and did his best by it. Many young people nowadays do nothing because they think themselves above the small, humdrum duties that lie near to them. It would do some of us good to remember Joseph in the jail and his cheerful discharge of what his hands found to do while he was there. That's so far Alexander McLaren. Now, some other points to make. So that's just his general conduct. But consider again his kindness to these two men, these officials. I pointed it out before, but just the fact that he walks in there and says, What's wrong, guys? Tell me. What's disturbed you? Why are you so distressed? Why are your faces cast down? I mean, these are prisoners who are rightly imprisoned. Who cares if they're worried? They should be. Right? But he doesn't treat them that way. He genuinely cares. Yes, they're being punished, but rightfully so, by Pharaoh. But you still treat them a certain way. Right? His kindness to these two men is remarkable. Consider also his ongoing confidence in God's sovereignty. It's amazing. Do not interpretations belong to God? Then tell them to me. I mean, here's the man who had been, he's got some run-ins with dreams in his past. And they really haven't exactly panned out. And here these men have dreams. He says, well, tell me the dreams. Interpretations belong to God. And I'll tell you the interpretation. And he gives them the interpretation. And then in confidence, he says in verse 14 to the cupbearer, just remember me when everything goes well. And talk to Pharaoh in this way. He's so assured that this will happen in 3 days. And how is Joseph confident that the interpretation of the dream is, one, rightly understood, and two, will certainly come to pass? There's nothing in his life other than the ongoing presence of God with him and the favor God has showed him to make him think that God has any power to bring these things about, or that he would choose to do so. Everything about his dream in the past would show him this will never take place. Dreams that God gives don't come to fulfillment. They don't materialize. They're nothing. He's not a cynic. I mean, wouldn't you have expected, if you knew Joseph and you knew his life, wouldn't you have thought that when they say, well, we've had these dreams, there's no one to interpret them? He would say, what good is a dream and an interpretation? Let me tell you my experience. I had dreams. I had 2 of them. And God gave me these dreams. And look what it got me. I mean, isn't that's what I would expect to hear from Joseph. But he says, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. And then he gives the man the interpretation. He says, now look, when it all happens, just like I told you, like God said it would, then you need to remember me, because I've been unjustly imprisoned and made a slave. What confidence. That's remarkable and is instructive for us. Right? He's received something from God, and then from that moment, everything in his life from that moment on has gone against it. But he's got supreme confidence in God. He hasn't wavered in his faith with God at all. It's like he's more confident almost. It's amazing. His confidence in God's sovereignty, which I think was well earned by God. God has earned his trust by the tender care he's had for Joseph through it all. Right? So he says, this is what's going to happen to you. And Joseph might think, this is amazing. He goes and tells his brothers, look what's going to happen. It's going to be great. Yeah, it's going to be good, but in ways you don't perceive yet. And in the meantime, until I make you ready to make it good in those ways, I'll be with you. You're going to have to go through a lot of things, but I'll be with you through it. That's instructive for us. Consider also the goodness of this man towards others, in spite of the fact that he knows he deserves nothing of the ill treatment he's received from many people. I mean, not for believers, because God's done a work in our heart, but most people, most of the time, when they have been mistreated by others, it breeds bitterness and contempt. It does. I mean, most people who are bitter and contemptuous and angry all the time and always doing wrong to other people, usually it's because they've been so wronged. Usually. That's the case. You find people who Paul tells us, hated and hating one another. That's the reality. That's what it is to live in a fallen world with fallen people. But this man, in spite of all the bad treatment he's received, is so good to everybody. He's good to Potiphar. He's good to all in Potiphar's house. He's wrongly accused. He's good to the jailer. Good to all the other prisoners who are wicked men. I mean, you think he never got insulted by any of those men? Was never the butt end of a joke? Never got anything thrown at him? Never some temperamental prisoner got upset and railed at him for something? Was never struck by someone? I doubt it. All those things probably happened regularly, routinely. But in time, men softened to him. Most of them probably. Certain prisoners were just incorrigible. But Joseph had a way of dealing with them where he got out generally unscathed, and it didn't come into this huge ordeal. What a thing. The goodness of this man in spite of deserving nothing of what he experienced at their hands. What else? Consider, one man called this chapter this. This is such a good, the turning point that changed nothing. The turning point that changed nothing. In one sense, we look at this chapter and think, oh, there was the dreams, and then later those men remember him, or this man remembers him, and it all changes. So it's this huge turning point. But for Joseph, it changed nothing. It's just this thing that happened. Yet two more people, or one more person at least, just to dump on him in life and treat him this way. Nothing changes. 2 years, not a year and a half, about 2 years, 2 whole years later, God sends a dream to Pharaoh that no one can interpret, and then this guy remembers. Oh yeah, there's this Hebrew slave in prison. Yeah, I had a dream, and he told me this. He tells him all about it. It's amazing. But this turning point that changed nothing. And all I want to say about that is this reality. Things happen maybe, like in your life. This happens all the time. We think of, it happens all the time in our prayer meetings. We assess situations this way. We had this conversation with this person, with this run-in. Seemed like significant things happened, but nothing came of it. Like, well, I don't know. And we kind of prayed about it for a while, and we just don't know. That could be just like here, the turning point that seemed, at least at the time, to have changed nothing, right? Our day-to-day lives, the encounters we have with people, the 20-minute conversations that we don't see the person again, they many times are this way. They are turning points for people, and they don't seem to change anything at the moment. Most of the time we talk about a turning point as you can see the pivot happen right before your eyes. Other times these things, it's like everything changes internally, or they change about the circumstances, but now the circumstances have changed, things have to work out and cook over there for a while before it affects you, like with Joseph. And this is the way things are. It's this way with teachers, right? Every teacher in a public school or any other school knows this. You're teaching the kids, and you're like, we're not getting anywhere. What's going on? And then 20 years later, the kid comes back and says, you changed my life. Like, what are you talking about? I remember you were always this way to me. Or you said this, and I learned this, and it's stuck with me forever. There are not a lot of those, but they happen. And they're turning points that seem to have changed nothing at the time. You didn't even know they were happening, but they were. This is part of what we mean when we say God works in mysterious ways. It's not, Looking back, we can see the direct cause and effect, but you could have never have guessed it or even had a clue it was happening at the time. Joseph didn't know it. He thought he had a chance to get out of prison and be set free from being a slave. But he didn't have that chance. He was actually, even when he's exalted to Pharaoh's right hand, he's in Pharaoh's service. He's just Pharaoh's slave now. Pharaoh just kind of says, no longer Potiphar's, but mine, is the way it is. He's just serving at the pleasure of Pharaoh. He's going to be a slave forever. He's never free. He gets out of the pit, but he's never free. His entire future is different than he's envisioned it. And yet exactly like the dream foretold. And so I'd say, let's remember Joseph in these ways. His character, his kindness, his confidence in God's sovereignty, his godliness, even at the hands of, that's what goes back to his character, but his goodness and his godliness to others in spite of wrong treatment. And then just the situation when he's in this turning point that changes nothing. To just have a confidence that God is working these things out. That's what I have for this chapter. Next time I teach, we'll be dealing with Pharaoh and these dreams and all that we find there. Anything anyone wants to ask or say?